Welcome to the channel. You may have seen the exciting news that could change the entire timeline on the bow and arrow. The paper is titled Arrowheads at Obi-Rakhmat, Uzbekistan, 80,000 years ago. It was published by Plisson et al. And it came out August 11th, 2025. But I actually first heard about this via a comment on the last video on the Aboriginal Australians. This would push the timeline back around 10,000 years, with the previous earliest date, and the one I've used in all my videos so far, being arrowheads in South Africa dated to around 70,000 years ago. So without further ado, let's actually jump into the paper. We're going to be breaking it down part by part. If you appreciate these kind of videos, please hit that like button. It really does help out. But let's get into it. Let's start off by breaking down the abstract. The authors point out that when we find stone weapon points in Neanderthal sites of the Middle Paleolithic, which is a huge date range from 300,000 to 45,000 years ago, but to be fair, things do stay relatively the same. Even over that 250,000 year period, it's the last 50,000 years of human history that have seen this explosion in tech. But those old stone weapon points are big, and they look like other multi-purpose tools, things you could use to butcher animals or process plants. While the genuinely tiny, purpose-built projectile tips, called microlithic armatures, or tiny rock things that you stick onto other things, so stone arrowheads, have really only shown up in clearly modern human Upper Paleolithic contexts, so from around 50,000 to 12,000 years ago. For a long time now, the consensus has been that the oldest arrowhead evidence are these stone points with microscopic wear patterns found in Sept Cave in South Africa. These are dated to around 72,000 to 64,000 years ago, and the oldest outside of Africa being in France at 54,000 years ago. All based off of observing the similar damage pattern on the stone, which is consistent with being used as arrowheads. And just so you understand how difficult it would be to find the actual bows, the oldest we have is much more recent, at only 9,000 years old for the oldest complete bow, found in a peat bog in Denmark. And the authors also set up their goal. They report on traceological or use-wear search for weapon tips in the oldest layers of Obi-Rakhmat, a rock shelter in northeastern Uzbekistan, in a layer dated to around 80,000 years ago. They briefly describe the lithic industry. It fits into the Levantine early Middle Paleolithic tradition, but with some innovations. Systematic blade production from several core types, plus bladelets, and within this assemblage they identify 3 types of projectile armature among 20 pieces that they pulled out for this detailed study. Large retouched points, smaller bladelets, and especially small, unretouched triangular micropoints that have so far gone unnoticed because they are so fragmentary. But basing this all on basic weapon design principles, these micropoints are too narrow to be hafted as anything other than arrow-like shafts, and they strongly resemble armatures from a later pioneer Sapiens site in the Rhone Valley, which is dated to around 50,000 years ago. So it has the same pattern, it's too small to be anything else. Basically, if it was found in a more recent context, this find wouldn't be that controversial. It's putting it at 80,000 years ago, which would change a lot of our timelines. Even some of the details and logic behind the arguments I've made in previous videos. So let's dive in. It does get very nuanced. But not to bury the lead, I am convinced by this. And the craziest part is that it might not be Homo sapiens. It could be bow and arrow wielding Neanderthals, or maybe even Denisovans. But let's jump into the introduction. The authors remind us that instrumented hunting, using constructed weapons rather than just hands and feet, is a defining trait of Homo. And because meat eating has had such big effects on our evolution, from brains to behavior and our social life, archaeologists want to find the earliest evidence for complex weapons. If it's very complex, we can infer that whoever made it must have a somewhat similar intelligence to later Homo sapiens. And they explain how archaeologists typically identify ancient hunting weapons. Usually it really is as simple as saying, what does it look like? Does it look like a spear? Does it seem like it could actually be used for something? And then you put it through the more advanced methods using quantitative indices like TCSA and TCSP, which can estimate how sharp or penetrating a point could be. And then you see if this matches on to ethnographic and experimental data. Over the decades, there have been enormous databases built up of all kinds of different wear patterns from all kinds of different weapons. The main issue, even with finding what could be parts of an arrow, is that it could be used to affix all sorts of things, from tools to cut up food or make crafts. But if it is to be used for hunting game, that's something else entirely. And so the best place to look is at the unique fingerprints left on the potential arrowhead itself. Arrows hitting flesh and bone leave unique forensics on the arrowhead. The authors point out that impact damage is highly variable. It depends on the weapon's design, delivery system, and what it hit. Unlike a scraper or drill, where you're seeing the same motion over and over again, usually on the same type of material, it all gives a very predictable wear pattern. Projectile IDs are always an inference based on how violent stresses broke the material. They also note that some damage can be misleading. Apical removals that look like impact can actually be rejuvenation flakes taken off via lateral tranchant blows, or tiny burn scars at the tip can turn an ordinary level wall flake into something that looks like a projectile point if you aren't being careful. In other words, you need to make sure that these very small rock pieces are purpose-made as arrowheads, not the leftovers caused by flaking off parts to make some bigger scraper or spearhead. Remember, you're doing tons of hits along the edge. They want to make sure that these microlithic points aren't just some sharp shards that broke off. And so to deal with these ambiguities, they lean heavily on long experimental and literature tradition that has tried to codify all the different projectile fracture types. They get into the importance of bending versus compressive stresses and fracture terminations. Does the fracture end in a feather, hinge, step, or other? And this can be used to distinguish high-velocity impacts from a person just hitting it on the side with another rock. Were these shards just some napping accident, broken off when trying to form that spearhead? Or even were they damaged post-deposition, meaning some other rock could have just fell on them and broke it off? All of this sets up the methodological backbone of the paper. Detailed fracture morphology and use-wear analysis guided by the experimental data. But the Obi-Rakhmat section actually looks at the place itself. It's a limestone niche in the Paltal Valley at about 1,250 meters elevation in the Talaski-Alatu range of the Tian Shan, about 100 kilometers from Tashkent, and this niche is oriented south and measures about 20 by 9 meters. It's actually been continuously excavated since the 1960s by Uzbek and then joint Uzbek-Russian teams. The stratigraphy is deep, 21 sedimentary layers across 10 meters of deposits, with each level having archaeological material. So this was some prime real estate. The stone industry is characterized by large blade production and unidirectional and bidirectional narrow-faced cores, and a whole bunch of bladelets from a variety of small core types. As for the timing and the fauna in this area, dating has produced a spread of ages from roughly 90,000 years ago at the bottom to around 40,000 years old at the top, and they're using everything from radiocarbon to U-series and ESR dating, and everything's consistent with this spot being occupied for tens of thousands of years. The animal bones are dominated by Siberian ibex and red deer, with smaller numbers of boar, roe deer, jackal, fox, marmot, and hare. Basically, the surrounding area was a mixed steppe-forest environment, and that is also backed up by pollen data. And the authors also remind us that this site yielded a famous set of human remains, a juvenile cranium and teeth, with what is described as a mosaic of Neanderthal-like dental traits, but ambiguous cranial morphology, leaving open whether this was Neanderthal or an archaic Homo sapiens. There was a similar debate at Jebel Arud in Morocco, which most think are the oldest Homo sapiens fossils at around 300,000 years ago, though the heavy debate here is on that line between archaic Homo sapiens or Neanderthal. Of course, there is no clean cutoff point. So what do we even mean by these terms when we get into these messy areas? It's very interesting that way over in Uzbekistan, we're seeing a very similar debate, confusion over this line between Neanderthal and archaic Homo sapiens. And if you watch the video on the Aboriginal Australians, their skulls are also very unique. I do have a whole video planned on just how cautious we should be when describing things just based on the skull shape, the morphology. But then the paper gets into the materials and methods. They analyze the lithics, rocks from several excavated seasons, 2001 to 2002, and 2007 through 2011. And they make the point that this is only over a 20 square meter area. Just in that small area, they found plenty to work with. And they focused on the deepest levels, 20 and 21. The samples include both classic typological pieces and tiny triangular flakes recovered from bulk bags of debris stored in Tashkent. First, they pre-sorted by eye, looking for potential impact damage, and after this initial cull, they examined candidates under a stereo microscope, trying to confirm interesting breakage or microdamage. Pieces with minimal erosion were then analyzed via reflective optical microscopy at up to 500 times magnification, and they're looking for microscopic linear impact traces, or MLIT, essentially the fine striations and scarring produced as the point punches into soft tissue and hits hard structures, the forensics on the arrowhead. And they didn't stop at 2D imaging. Multi-focus photography was processed to improve depth of field, and they created high-resolution 3D models of micropoints using a structured light scanner, and visualized them using Artifact 3D. Because the raw material and surface alteration made detailed microscopic wear tough to find in many cases, their determinations lean heavily on fracture morphology, whether breaks indicate bending versus compression, how the terminations look, and where lateral damage appears. They ground all of this in about 40 years of projectile use wear literature, plus their own experimental corpus of 500 plus flint points used as arrows, darts, and spears on medium to large mammals. They explicitly note that popular gelatin ballistic gels don't accurately replicate the stress conditions inside animal bodies, and so they can mislead interpretations. And they work with the same kind of local silicified limestone. By napping replicas, they watched what kinds of accidental breaks occur during production, which could help them avoid misclassifying napping accidents as impact damage. Now we get to the results. Out of the ongoing lithic inventory from levels 20 to 21, they selected 20 pieces that convincingly behave like projectile armatures, based on macroscopic criteria and their experimental yardstick. Even that small number, they argue, already shows recurring morphologies in distinct damage types, and modeling studies suggest that this count is actually relatively high for the area excavated, since projectiles tend not to be produced, used, and discarded in the same location. In other words, only pulling from 20 square meters. The fact that they did find 20 that do seem to be arrowheads, which itself is a data point that these were made on purpose, that this is part of some sort of industry here. They emphasize that the fragments of the arrowheads still left on the shafts are of course more likely to be brought back to the camp, while the fragments that broke off might be left in the carcass and could have been thrown away or left far from the shelter. But of those 20, they have 3 distinct classes of armature: large, fairly massive points from 25 to 35 grams, and much lighter micro points from only 1 to 4.5 grams. And these are all broken, and there are bladelets. Then they described the large retouched points in some detail. 2 are almost complete, around 38 to 41 millimeters wide, and both have crushed tips from axial impact. A third is an apical half with similar crushing, and another point from a younger layer at 19 shows an apical fragment badly chipped along the edge by some sort of tangential impact. Several pieces have clear proximal thinning, indicating a hafting arrangement. It was stuck into something. One long, thicker point has a wavy feather-terminated apical fracture, likely from compressive stress, and a large proximal fragment shows a lateral fracture that really only makes sense if the point was at the end of a long shaft, like a spear. So they know how these people made spear points. The micropoints make up another group. They're small, triangular pieces with clear impact fractures or crushed tips. Some show macroscopic breakage plus microscopic impact traces, linear striations, and tiny scars, indicating that they penetrated soft matter and then struck a hard surface like bone. And they walk through the key examples in figures 7 through 9 to show how these patterns differ from simple napping incidents when you're making one of those larger spearheads. The third group, bladelets, is rarer in this particular subsample because their initial sorting focused on axial armatures. Most of these were rejected because it was impossible to tell whether they broke during the napping or from use, but 2 bladelets were retained, one with equivocal bending fracture, but very telling post-fracture retouching, and another with burning or lateral crushing, consistent with the use as a lateral insert on a projectile shaft. There are several ways that these could be produced, but all the different ways seem to make up 20 to 30% of the lower layers, which yield triangular flakes that match the archaeological micropoints. So these micropoints are integrated into the broader technology of these people. They weren't just accidents or some rare one-offs. The real question is, how do you tell if something is a spear or an arrow? And so the discussion section tackles what they were actually mounted on. going over examples from daggers, hand stakes, hand-thrown spears, spears or darts with spear throwers, something like an atlatl, arrows fired from bows, or darts fired from blowguns. Basically, you're moving from heavy, tough points at one end to tiny, delicate points at the other. Arrows and blowgun darts have much lower impact power, so they rely critically on the sharpness and slenderness to penetrate deeply. That means design constraints for their tips are very different. The authors review experimental work showing that the severity and type of damage scales with impact energy. Javelin tips tend to be more thoroughly shattered than arrowheads, but they also point out that no one has yet produced a universally reliable numerical threshold, because there's just too many interacting variables. They argue that the only really solid, qualitative criterion to distinguish between light and heavy projectiles is lateral flexion breaks that run edge to edge. These require the lever arm of a long, heavy shaft. And they also mention newer work that uses the balance of bending versus compression fracture components to separate hand-thrown javelins from arrows or darts. But note that even this doesn't distinguish arrows from darts yet, only heavy versus light projectiles. Applying all of this, they interpret the large, retouched points as spearheads, but the micro points are so small and narrow that they are mechanically unsuitable for tips of heavy spears or javelins. And there's so many that they seem to be done on purpose. The only way that they could work effectively is that they must be mounted on very light, arrow-like shafts. The presence of clear impact damage and MLIT on several micropoints confirmed that they were actually used as penetrating projectiles. Now, they do address a very funny thing you might not have heard of before, is that a critique from some experts is that maybe these tiny points were part of some children's weapons, basically toy versions of bigger spears. But the authors argue that that doesn't fit here at Obi-Rakhmat. The micropoints here have a totally different design, they're not copies of the large heads, and they're napped according to different reduction sequences. They're not practice points, they're not accidental, and they take significant skill to pull off. And remember, the impacts, the MLITs, the whole point of it is to be able to tell the difference between a person just hitting something by hand. If I'm some kid at camp who wants to pretend like they're hunting the animal, and they take their little toy spear and jab it into the animal, it will go through soft tissue and then hit the bone, but it won't have anywhere near the same level of force. But another alternative theory is that they were blowgun darts. The authors mention blowguns from the Cherokee to Southeast Asian examples, and note that while blowguns can achieve impressive dart speeds and hunting range, they're usually light wooden bamboo splinters. They're just sharp pieces of wood. They're not tipped with stone or bone. It just makes it too heavy. The simplest hypothesis is that they are just arrowheads. It's not like they're saying it's 1,000,000 years ago. It's only 10,000 years older than that site in South Africa. So taking it all together, this does seem like the simplest explanation. And so they zoom out to the big evolutionary question, noting that elsewhere in Eurasia, diversification of projectile armatures and complex propulsion systems, like spear throwers and bows, tend to be linked with modern humans in the initial or upper Paleolithic. If we use the complexity of projectile systems as a proxy for Sapiens-style behavior, the authors think we may be looking at the evidence of a really interesting transitional period. Over millennia of introduction of different Homo species, again, when that species designation, while useful, is not as strict as lay people think it is, of course they're all intermixing. Over in Uzbekistan 80,000 years ago, we're overlapping with Neanderthal and Denisovan areas. And you throw in what is even archaic Homo sapiens, and you get into the fact that some modern Homo sapiens groups did not have the bow and arrow. I covered this in the Aboriginal Australian video, but while rare, there are some other groups that never developed the bow, like the Selknam people of South America. And to me, it just gets into the most interesting aspect of things I want to cover on this channel, trying to understand the mind of these people, from ancient Sumerians to Egyptians, to humans around 100,000 years ago, and our hominin relatives. In one respect, their minds seem to be so similar, but of course in other ways, their entire existence is so alien to us, you just gotta wonder what was going on in their minds. As I always say, you can go back millions of years and see that all of us in the Homo genus are humans doing human things. And in case you're wondering, I'm not teasing on purpose, it really just takes me this long to put all this together, but I am very open to the idea of morphic fields. Some sort of non-local intelligence, start to look at evolution and human history as not just being strictly contained in the biology of these single units, a single brain and a body. There are cultural and technological aspects to human existence that line up in really odd ways. I've stressed before that we should never take it for granted that some people group develop something. People can go a very long time without writing, without any plant or animal domestication, even without tools like the bow and arrow. But while this site pushes it back maybe 10,000 years, and now the oldest example in the world is 80,000 years ago, I do find it interesting that we see this explosion of bow and arrow tech across people groups who supposedly were not in contact with each other, when we are supposed to be the same anatomically modern human with just as much mental faculty for the past 200,000 years at least. It took us at least 120,000 years to start making bows, but then people from Europe to Central Asia and South Africa are all doing it within 10,000 years of each other. And in the morphic field script I'm working on, there's way more fascinating examples when it comes to domestication. Although some people groups get to this thousands of years before others, in the Anatolia and Mesopotamia region, supposedly they're in no contact with the people of the Americas, and on the grand scale of our modern Homo sapiens timeline, again at least 200,000 years old, the percentage difference between those farmers in Mesopotamia and farmers in Central America is only a few percentage points off. Somehow our mental capacity is dramatically changing over the years. Anyways, a little teaser for that video. And as for this Uzbekistan site, let me know what you think. Are you convinced by this evidence? I think taken all together, it's a very measured interpretation. It seems straightforward to me. There doesn't seem to be a lot of reaching, and it doesn't go that much against the timeline. It's only pushing it about 10,000 years back, but where it's happening is very interesting. In this sort of nexus of Homo sapiens expansion, deep into Neanderthal and Denisovan territory. Let me know what you think down in the comments and make suggestions for future videos. Please hit that like button, it really does help out, and I'll see you in the next one.